All right, we got the diehards back in the room. I like to see that. Okay, we have a tradition at this conference. I think this is probably a 20-plus year tradition, and that's the last panel of the day is mostly a question and answer sort of thing. We can have some brief presentations, but we get to a discussion, and a discussion where we try to let the audience play a major role, and that's part of the tradition. The other part of the tradition is that we tend to gather all the, gosh, I better pick my words carefully. All the elders who participated in the conference. Those, the people who have been in the trenches for the last 30 or 40 years. I don't know what that means.
That's following that.
No, it's kind of all woven together.
Okay, so
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's part of what we're going to figure out as we go. But we decided, the ad hoc committee here decided, rather than at the end get the people up here, and the pessimist of me would say, rather than get the people up here that drove the truck in the ditch, let's get the people up here that are going to have to pull the truck out of the ditch. So let's get some young guns up here. So we formed this young gun panel. That was what we were calling it. And yes, there were many discussions about what constitutes young. And ultimately, John and I think we settled on, if they're younger than us, they're young. And then we recruited Luke to lead the effort, at least get it started. But the tradition recently has been for John and I to then help with the discussion. And so that's where I'm a little confused. So we have Luke and John. We have 3 moderators and 4 panelists. And if you want to know the power of these young guns, we need almost 1 moderator per panelist to handle it. So we'll see how that works. But at least the first half of this, Luke is just going to do what Luke does, because that's how it works. And then we'll figure out what to do after that. And if we're having fun, we'll continue to have fun. And if we're not having fun, we'll all go to the Grateful Dead concert, or just hang out in the parking lot where there's a lot of glaucoma medicine. So if you want to do that, okay. All right, so to get us started, let me hand it off to Luke. And I think it was Alice this morning that said some really nice things about Luke. And I don't know if you noticed, but as she was saying nice things about you, there were many heads, including mine, in the audience that were going, yeah, bobbing in agreement. He is has become a very good water journalist in the region, and we could certainly need that. I think Alice also noted that you spent the last year and a half here at CU as a Scripps Fellow program in the journalism school. I'm hoping getting even better at your craft, and so that's wonderful. And so I'm going to hand it off to you. You do whatever you want with these people, and when they are tired of them, tell me and John, and then we'll do something with it.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks, Doug, for that nice intro. So like Doug said, I just finished the Ted Scripps Fellowship here at the University of Colorado. That wrapped up at the end of April, beginning of May. And I actually spent a lot of my time in the law school during that fellowship, because as a part of that fellowship, you get to audit courses at the university. You can kind of take whatever you want and learn about whatever you want. And the law school has a lot of classes about the environment, natural resources. I even took a law seminar on the law of the Colorado River here at the law school. It's a very niche topic, and so it feels like a great home to have these kind of conversations. I do think that one thing that came out of that fellowship was realizing that I did not want to become a lawyer, which is maybe like a nagging disease of many journalists, of thinking that maybe someday you want to go to law school and become a lawyer. So I feel like the fellowship finally dispelled me of that affliction. And I'm really excited for this panel because it's the last panel. We get to kind of close out this conference on the Colorado River. We were instructed to be hopeful. That was our That was our charge as a panel, which is quite the challenge considering a lot of the content over the last couple days, but we're gonna do our best. Even harder because I just came from the Colorado River Delta. I basically flew from the Colorado River Delta here to Boulder to be a part of this conference. And there's glimmers of hope there, but I think that's really a place and a landscape where you can just kind of see how huge the challenges are in the Colorado River Basin. So that's fresh in my mind and also why I'm kind of sunburnt. So I'm going to kick things off by letting our panelists briefly introduce themselves. And then I'd also love to hear just a quick reaction to the news that we got earlier this week. When you heard this 2 to 4 million acre feet that has kind of been the cloud that's hung over this whole conference, what was your initial reaction? John, do you want to start first?
Thanks, Luke. And thanks, everyone. So I'm John Berggren, a water policy analyst for Western Resource Advocates, a conservation nonprofit. And it's fun to be at this conference because I did my graduate school work here at CU, and Doug was actually my advisor. And I'm glad that Doug did not do introductions because after 8 years of being his student, I'm sure he had some stories to tell, and we'll bring them up in an introduction for sure. And so I guess my initial reaction after I picked my jaw up was getting through that initial shock of 2 to 4 million acre feet. I was actually quite optimistic because that presents a huge opportunity. And I think for 100 years, we've been doing this kind of incremental adding on to the law of the river. We've been tweaking with it. We've been doing some pretty significant fixes here and there, 2007 guidelines, Minute 319. But you could argue a lot of that was incremental for a variety of reasons. And now we have this opportunity at with the direction of the Interior Department on we need to conserve 2 to 4 million acre feet. That's a fundamental change in this river. And that's kind of a transformative change. I think we can use this crisis as an opportunity to reprioritize our values on the river. If we're talking that scale of shortage, 2 to 4 million acre feet, that's a rethinking of how we manage this river, how we prioritize this river, what our values are, and how they were reflected in the management of this river. And so I'm actually quite optimistic that this is now the time that we can update better reflect our values in our new governance structure. And so I'm hopeful that we'll take advantage of this and reprioritize those values and make sure that we, going forward, have a governance system that now reflects 2022 values and does not reflect 1922 values anymore. I think I am optimistic that this kind of will get us there.
I'm Daniel Cordalis. We met this morning. I'm a 2011 graduate of this law school, so since then I've been working in different capacities, working on tribal issues and natural resources and law issues. Recently left the Interior Solicitor's Office, and I'm going to be jumping back around. I'll be around again soon. So that's my backstory. My reaction, I'll keep this very short, Luke, was, holy shit. Camille, go for it, right? I'm like, this is good. I think I alluded to earlier this morning, sometimes we just need the feds to say, come on, states, that we spent a lot of time working in California and seeing kind of what maybe needs to happen in other places, what needs to motivate folks. And it's like, this is it. This is, get it, Camille, get it. That's what I thought.
I am Sara, Porterfield, Water Policy, Trout Unlimited. And when I was just telling Luke this story, I went for a run Tuesday morning and I'm running late as usual. And I'm like, okay, I'll just put the hearing on my headphones and I'm making breakfast and it's playing in the background. Camille's talking, I think. And my husband starts talking to me and I think it was something actually very important about his job. And I was like, you need to stop talking right now. I have to this. And then I went in my office. I don't even think I got my breakfast, did get my coffee. And I don't think I came out for another like 3 or 4 hours because I was trying to figure out what was happening. But I think, there was that initial, like, this is big, this is really big. And then I felt very similarly to John of this is a huge opportunity. And especially with, you just heard about from Corey about TU's work on the ground and all of the optimism that work gives me. Like John, this is an opportunity for seeing how we can scale up that work, for seeing what this looks like when we really go big for water conservation and the health of this system.
Hello, can you hear me? My name is Amy McCoy, and I'm a consultant with AMP Insights. And my first reaction upon hearing the news was that I needed a little time to figure out what my reaction was. And that has kind of unfurled over this week. And I live in Colorado Springs and was out for a little morning hike that morning and was just kind of overcome with how beautiful the mountains were and how much I loved the place. And I was sort of swooning on nature. And I come in and I hear this news. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, like there's a big risk here. And then I heard this afternoon when Lorelei spoke, she opened her comments by saying, we sit on Ute lands, unceded Ute lands. And my first thought upon hearing her say that was the absolute unimaginable grief of the tribes of losing the place that they loved and that they lived. And that's something we can all lean into, that grief, but also maybe this moment of hearing the condition that our basin is like we're at risk of losing this place that we all love so deeply. And I was very moved by Lorelei's comment and just wanted to acknowledge that. So I think my first reaction was actually grief and fear. My second reaction was listening to John Fleck's questions posed of what happens to our communities if we do lose water. And I wanted to flip the coin on its head and say, well, wait a minute, what if we actually figure this out? Like, what if we step into a place where we can learn from the mistakes and the violence of the past, and we can change our actions and we can figure this out? Like, what if we're people who have the magnitude of imagination or the depth of compassion or the courage that surprises us, that we can do all the things that we're most afraid of, and that in the end, we can figure this out in a way that is respectful to everybody and all the things that depend on this basin. So my journey in this went from grief to maybe even a paradoxical belief in us. That's it.
Look how hopeful we're being. So with all of that optimism on the table, what are the big barriers, obstacles that would keep the basin from actually rising to the occasion? And do you feel that we're well equipped to overcome those barriers or obstacles? Anyone want to take it? Yeah, Amy. Yeah.
I'll take on the circular methodology here. I think the other thing that struck me from the conversation at this conference is that we've spent a lot of time, it feels, talking about the symptom of the problem. The river flows are the symptom of the problem. Aridification is the symptom of the problem. The problem is climate change and emissions. And I feel like maybe not an obstacle, but a question that I would have is, at what point and in what way can we begin talking about how our responses to water scarcity and our responses to livelihoods, have an intersection point with thinking about emissions and to thinking about either how we respond to climate change, how we contribute to emissions, or how we actually work to mitigate or lessen our emissions. Because at the end of the day, it's climate change that's the problem at the moment, one of the problems. And I wonder what we can do to actually solve that problem as well as address all the symptoms of the problem.
I'm going to go to so I'm not a lawyer. I am not trained in water policy. I'm a historian by training. I got my PhD here at CU, which is how I know John, or rather that's because of our dogs, I think, but. And so I think one of the major barriers, and Ann Kessel said this yesterday, I don't think I'm going to get her wording exactly right, but she said, history is present in everything we do, and we have to think about history to resolve today's problems. And I think that, we have a lot of anniversaries this year. Today is Reclamation's 120th anniversary. It's the 100th anniversary of the compact. If we can truly understand the historical context of when these institutions and documents that govern how we manage this system were created, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in the study of history for empathy and compassion to grow from that. For people, for communities, for nature, for all sorts of different sectors that use water. And I think that by more fully understanding historical context, we can understand how we have changed and how we can move forward from that. So I think that, we're supposed to be a very forward-looking panel, but my instinct is to always think about where have we come from, what can we learn from that, and how can we move forward? So I think an understanding of historical context is really important.
That's right, Sarah. I think it's really interesting, especially when we were talking about the compact, right? The time we spent yesterday, thinking about when that came from. And one of the things I was really, 1922, what was going on? Even before that for tribes. And we're talking about full-on assimilation. We're talking full-on allotment, pulverizing machine to break up tribal nations and break up just tribes. Not until 34 did we, walk that back. Just months before the compact was signed, the federal government basically Interior came up and set up a Navajo tribal government system, something that the government could come basically contract with to get oil and work on mineral rights on the tribe. So, we think about thinking about this compact. The tribes weren't there because tribes were not there. Nobody was going to invite them. We have what is it, in effect, savings clause, which has been extremely important, but just history, right? But so. Barriers moving forward. I have a lot of these things to talk about. All my law stuff I didn't talk about before, I could talk about now, but I'll try to keep it short. I think there's a couple of things, right? Who talked about it earlier? It may have been Daryl yesterday, but we talked about a lot of the basin has been living off of and been supported by unused, uncompensated tribal water. Let's be honest. So we talk about economics. We talk about the three things that agriculture wants: price, price, price. We talk about getting the most we can for our water, not the least. Let's also talk about all that water that's passed through the system for the last 100 years. So we need to find ways for tribes to get water, right? Whether it's access to clean drinking water and the incredible initiatives we have around that, or just some structural barriers, right? What does it take for a tribe to get water? I'm Navajo. We have been working for decades on trying to figure out how to get water from the main stem, what that looks like. We have one active case which has been pared down to a very, very narrow legal issue that got hit up in the Ninth Circuit. We got a good ruling out of the Ninth Circuit, but it's being opposed by all the states, right? We're just talking about what basically constitutes a trust responsibility from the United States. And the Ninth Circuit says that the Navajo Treaty, which was signed June 1st, in 1968, the Winters Doctrine, the Winters case, and the federal control over the Colorado River basically constitutes enough of a corpus to kind of create a trust duty or like a fiduciary duty for that will at least allow a narrow claim of the tribes to go forward. Not a quantification claim, not a we want water, so give it to us claim. Basically just one that says the government should probably plan for it and think about it in some other planning documents. That's simplification, of course, but I think that's really what's going on in that case. That's being opposed, right? We're having opposition from there. So the tribes have this huge barrier to entry into getting water. We've talked about this. It's, I think Ann Kessel described it as a rounding error for a lot of places. My family hauls water. We'll always haul water, probably. That's just the way it is in these spots. So that kind of leads to the question is, how do we address these unquantified tribal water rights? And they're unquantified because it's really hard to quantify them. And we haven't done a serious enough effort to do it. We have had a lot of money recently through the administration to handle a lot of water rights, tribal water rights settlements, but those are the ones we've already done. What about the ones we still need to work on, right? Where do those sit? So, just very briefly, those are a couple of the major barriers I see going forward.
So I think the two big barriers or challenges I see, one, climate change, as Amy mentioned, and obviously that's a global challenge, but we're having, you want to talk about climate crisis examples, like our two largest reservoirs are draining and we are seeing them drop even more in the next few years. This basin of 7 states, some of which are very large states, there's red and blue and purple states, could come together and I think galvanize a lot of folks to get on board with more climate action. So I think climate change is a big challenge. And then 2 is this kind of crisis narrative that we're seeing around this discussion, I think is going to be a big challenge. Historically, not the best things can happen when you're dealing with a crisis. You can ram through a lot of things that maybe aren't the best. And I worry that if we let the crisis narrative provide context for the negotiations as they come up, things are going to be lost, like environmental values, environmental flows. I worry we won't address the tribal situation. I think that crisis narrative is a big challenge, and I would hope that we can look past, and that's why I'm optimistic, is I don't think it's a crisis yet. I think it's an opportunity. I hope other folks kind of take that narrative as well.
I think that one thing, just to kind of go off of that I've been struck by is, I've been covering the Colorado River since 2017 as like a beat. So I'm like thinking of it every day for those 5 years. And it seems like the Overton window of like what people thought was possible or what would happen in the course of those 5 years, like even just in 2017, of people wouldn't have thought that we would be here having these kinds of conversations. That has struck me, and it's kind of watching it in real time is crazy. I wonder, like, do you feel that same thing? Like, do you feel like the conversations that you're hearing here and with other people, that the realm of possibilities of fixes and solutions is getting larger, and that people are kind of contemplating solutions that they might not have just because what they're seeing in reality is kind of changing in front of them? John, do you want to start and go back down?
Short answer, yes. Like that, I had the same realization. I started researching this river in 2010, and yeah, back then a lot of these things were off the table, and a lot of the talk was around augmentation. And as Doug and I were just chatting earlier, like I don't think anyone said augmentation once at this conference. But we have been talking about bigger picture solution. I mean, 2 to 4 million acre feet, like that was never talked about. And now that's on the table, and we have to figure a plan for that in the next 60 days. And so I think the range of options being discussed is definitely getting bigger, and I'm encouraged by that. But I don't think it's quite there yet. I think we can keep having, we keep expanding the conversation we're having. Like I said earlier, like this is a fundamental inflection point for this river. Now is the time to think big. And I would encourage everyone to continue thinking big.
In terms of additional opportunities that are being developed, that's the thing, or the question again, Luke, sorry.
Yeah, just like, is the window of opportunity expanding in this moment? And do you feel like people are kind of able to engage with more solutions just because of how daunting the challenge is?
I'm very encouraged and very interested in the work, at least that the tribal communities are doing to support each other and trying to figure out how to be involved, right? So I think that window, I mean, it's hard work. You have 30 sovereigns in the basin, tribal governments, and everyone has a different angle, right? So it's commonality is difficult. In the Klamath, we had a hard time with 2 tribes at a time finding commonality. But you know, there are things, and I think it's access is what we're talking about really for the tribal communities, is having that. And from what I understand from some of the folks is that has got some traction, so I feel good about that. So in that way, I think there is an expansion and ability to bring these voices in. So I think that's good.
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity. And I think we're all going to have to work really hard to make sure that window doesn't close. Because as others have talked about today, Karen was talking earlier about everybody's kind of scared right now, right? And what do we do when we're scared? We do the things that we know how to do. And what we need to do is not the things that we've done over the last 100+ years. So we're going to have to keep that in mind, be really aware that we're going to have to work hard to keep that window open. That opportunity is there. It's not just going to happen. And we have to be willing to be kind of scared to do new things and take those, what might feel like risks, to make sure that the system stays healthy or gets healthy.
Yeah, I was teetering on the edge of not offering a hopeful answer here. I think in some ways, yes. Like the answer to your question is yes. There are different things being considered, but maybe the reason different things are being considered is because that's the next thing right in front of us. So like the 2 to 4 million acre feet is right in front of us. And I think maybe my skepticism is that the opportunities or the solutions or the creative thinking will circulate mostly on that 2 to 4 million acre feet, when it would be amazing to step beyond that, to see that as an entree into addressing the bigger issues of the basin, like tribal water. Using this as an opportunity to say, we are going to look forward in this basin to not kind of magic water or pretend water or uncompensated water, but to the water that is actually there, and figure out how we can live within that in a respectful and robust way, and see maybe 10 or 20 years down the line to consider water for ecosystems in the Colorado River Delta, to have this be a more comprehensive, respectful, and acknowledgement of the future that we need to build. I mean, we are actively constructing our future right now. It's not like we're actively constructing a crisis response. I mean, we are, but a little bit beyond that, we're actively constructing the future. And what kind of future do we want to live in? And what kind of respect do we want to pay to the people that we're living in this basin with? And if that's our starting point, then I feel like the opportunity table opens up considerably. And I hope that we will step into that.
There's this really familiar tension on the river between this incremental approach versus like a blow it all up, radical rethinking. And I wonder if we could get into like some specifics. So like prior appropriation, is that like Could it be the way forward? Are we going to work within that same system to solve this problem? Or do we need to kind of have a more fundamental rethinking of the kind of legal framework, legal structure of how we manage water in the West?
You know, prior appropriation is always an interesting term, right? Because prior appropriation depends a lot on the date that it begins at, I think. And in some ways in this basin, we've determined the date. But if prior appropriation, you know, acknowledges the environment, tribes, agriculture, city, then it's sort of an honoring perhaps of the notion of prior appropriation, but reconsidering the sequence in which, you know, appropriations are made. And so there we go, we'll burn it down there. That was a discussion we had earlier. But I think, you know, just reconsidering not just how we don't use water, but how we use water and how we use the water that's available to us within the legal system or outside of the legal system, depending on how bold we want to get.
I have a sticky note. I have a lot of sticky notes on my computer. I have another sticky note. We talked about one earlier. That says, it's a quote from Shannon Watts from Moms Demand Action, who's it's a gun control group. I don't know if that's how they characterize themselves, but it says, relentless incrementalism leads to revolution. And I read that multiple times a day to me, that you don't have to blow it all up to have a revolution. Maybe, I don't know, we'll see. And I lost my train of thought. Go ahead, sorry, I'm just.
Great. Once you're back on track. But I think I agree, right? I mean, I don't think blowing up the system is what needs to happen. I mean, practically, I don't think it can. I think we've talked about this earlier. I mean, the compact itself isn't irrelevant, right? I mean, we're able to build things into it. And prior appropriation, I mean, let's just take that as a doctrine. And I think I mentioned this morning, you know, it was created for a set of values for that moment when we were trying to build and settle the West and trying to basically create something, right? People were coming here and they're moving. So this law came out of, you know, mining camps. Basically, it created what it created. We're not creating that anymore. But prior appropriation, the states have taken, and you know, states have the dominion over a lot of this, and they've taken it different places. And so I think there's, you know, we can handle some of these frameworks in different ways, and through state legislatures, right? And we've heard ways to handle problems that we have through litigation when necessary, through legislation when appropriate. So I think it's there. I've also had the tremendous opportunity to work with both Charles Wilkinson and Greg Hobbs, right? Charles was I worked with him as a research assistant here, and I was a clerk for Justice Hobbs. And of course, a lot of you will remember they're back and forth in some of the law review articles where Charles wrote, prior appropriation is dead, and Justice Hobbs comes back and they say, no, it's not. And so, you know, you get these really interesting views on the systems, right? But, you know, my take at this point is there are a lot of things that Justice Hobbs would say, you know, prior appropriation works, it has these certain, you know, he's like, well, you know, for tribes it should work because, you know, they have a lot of the oldest rights and it should work for them. Of course, exercising all that, it's a different thing. But in theory, it can work. But it's really what we look at in prior appropriation, right? What's a beneficial use? You know, I think about beneficial uses all the time, and how do we evaluate them? How do you prove them up? You know, how do you take them to the state engineers and say, oh yeah, here, I'm still doing what I said I'm doing, and this still is actually beneficial. I mean, is it still to the state? Mark Swalacci asked a question about alfalfa yesterday, and this is a question we ask in the Klamath River Basin all the time because we have the issues there are easier, but they're harder in the same ways that here. But where it's just it's almost just ag versus ecosystem / tribes. But we think about where the water goes, right? Is the water being grown and shipped overseas? Like that's, we don't love that. But is that a beneficial use? Does the state of Oregon say it is? So whose power is that to change that? The state of Oregon's. So I think there's a lot of ability that the humans have and the basin citizens have to change laws, right? Laws are supposed to be reflections of our values and what we need as a society. So I think we have the power to change it if we don't like it, right? I think that's actually was the answer. I think maybe that the folks in the panel had mentioned yesterday too. So if that's what we want, then we can do it. The system's there. Building up something new that we don't know has a lot of risks too.
So I think my specific answer to your question is we don't need to blow it up. We can work within it. I think what Daniel was just saying, I totally agree that we can change what definitions are. We can change what beneficial use is. We can work within the system. We've shown over 100 years it's a flexible system. And so if you wanted to change allocations to percentages, I think there's a way you could do that within the existing system. I realize that's a tall order, but I think you can work within the system. You don't need to completely replace it. And I totally agree with Daniel where he said laws should reflect our values. And as a society, if we don't see that, we should change it. And I think that's a really good point. The more abstract answer I guess I'd have is, I'm not sure if it works within prior appropriation in the existing system, but reflecting those values needs to be top priority. And so one thing that I always go back to, I think is really interesting, was the Australia example. And when they did the Federal Water Act in 2007, I'm going to oversimplify this, but they basically reprioritize how water is used in that river system, that the number one top priority is essential human needs. So humans get water. In this case, I'd say that obviously includes the tribe. So we have every human gets essential human needs. The next priority is the environment and making sure that we have a healthy river system. And then the third priority is everything else. And I think conceptually, that's a really interesting framework for how we allocate this river. And I would think most people in this room and most people in the basin would agree in some regard to that set of values. And so we should have laws that reflect those values. And so kind of abstract, I'm not sure that works within prior appropriation, but you get the idea.
Not to bring the optimism down, but I feel like in the conversations that I've been having with people since this announcement, going back to the announcement, came out on Tuesday, is you can already see the posturing and people kind of carving out, agencies, entities, institutions, carving out positions to lead into this round of negotiations that's going to happen. And it seems like there's a certain amount of who's going to blink first on committing to doing some of these solutions that you're talking about. And I wonder how you break free of that brinksmanship. How would you, what would your charge be to the people who are going to be in the room making those decisions, if you could have their ear?
So there's been a lot of talk last 2 days on equity, and I think a lot of it has been intra-generational equity. And what I would say to those people in the room is think intergenerational equity. And so I think a lot of this now. My wife and I just had our first kid. She's a 6-month-old, and anyone who's been sitting around me has probably seen pictures. She's the cutest baby ever. And so, but it's kind of shifted how I think about things, right? And thinking, what kind of river do I want her growing up around? Is it a river where there's no flows in the Grand Canyon? That's really sad to me that could be a reality for her. So thinking about that intergenerational equity and what we're going to leave things, I think hopefully is a powerful selling point. And I think Bill Hazenkamp this morning, when he said, in 20 years, what are we going to look back and see what we did in this window? And I think it'd be really powerful. We look back and we said, well, we honored the tribal federal trust responsibility and got the tribes the water that they had the rights to. We brought the river into some level of sustainability. we saw that some of our rural communities and agriculture communities were maybe going away because we weren't planning ahead, but we established just transition centers in our offices in every state and every county. We made sure that those communities were thriving. And then we have water flowing in the Delta every year. Like, thinking that scale, like intergenerational equity, what do we want to look back and see right now, what we did, I would hope would be motivating. I know that's a bit, not super specific, but that's how I think about things now. I think that's what I would charge the folks in the room as well.
What I would say, well, I think the motivating factor is you don't want the federal government to and states don't want the federal government to make up their mind for them, right? Of course, but the time frame is so short. I think beyond that time frame, let's say, I think having notions of like let's create the best thing we can do to, if states to retain your power, build in your flexibility there to revisit these and figure out a system also to handle this. Whether or not you come back and like reevaluate everything. Basically, whether it's annually or depending on the state's changing needs, whatever it is, I think there's like, how do you figure out another system of governance, right? That is up and down the basin, is the full thing now, right? And that's look to that as like this moment where you kind of recreate just a framework, a skeleton right now that you can start fleshing out. I think that's. To me, it feels like that would be a motivating thing, but you can just basically get the ball rolling in a way that you can live with and then be adjusting it into the future.
I think my suggestions are similar to John's in that they're not super specific, a little bit more, I don't know, bigger picture. But I think that my charge would be, we need to think, this is not an engineering problem. So for so long, this system has been thought of as an engineering problem, right? In the early 20th century, after the Colorado River flooded the Imperial Valley, created the Salton Sea, right? I think this was when it was described this way. The Colorado was described as, like a Mustang in a balsa wood corral that we have to tame, we have to control it, right? We have to engineer a fix to this river system. And since then, a lot of the solutions, the decisions, et cetera, have been engineering or technical. How do we think about this as a human problem and a human nature relationship problem? And problem, I say, as something to get into and to solve and to fix, not as, well, I guess it's problematic on a lot of levels. But how do we put humans and our relationship to nature at the center of this? That means tribes absolutely are at the table, have water, have influence, have power, right? Start there. Nature has power. Every sector has power. We need to think about this from, I can't remember who said, maybe it was Ted who said it yesterday in talking about the Marshall fires. We all have a lot of our heart in this, right? I live 2 miles down the road. I got evacuated twice over the winter because of fires. We all have a story like that, right? We all have emotion tied up in this. And I think that when we can recognize that this river is a human problem, we all have a lot of ourselves tied up in it and the communities that reside in this basin, we're gonna go a lot further than thinking about this as a system of plumbing that can have a technical fix.
All right, well, yes to all of that. And if the question is, what would I say to the people who are in the room, then I would presume that I'm having a personal conversation with them. And so I would say something quite personal, actually. And evoke the spirit of my grandmother, actually. She died when she was 97, and I had the privilege of sitting with her as she was dying. And as she was in and out, I said to her, one of the final things I said to her was, whenever you were in the room, everybody rose to their higher self. Everybody was kinder. Everybody was more thoughtful of others' problems and others' pain. Everybody was better. And she opened her eyes and looked right at me and she said, really? And then she kind of took a moment and she's like, really? That's how it should be. And then a few days later, she died. And I feel like if I was speaking to the people who were negotiating in the room about the future of this basin, 40 million people, the history of everybody who's lived here, I would say to them, if you can be the person that everybody else is better around, then that's the place we want to negotiate from.
We had a planning call before this panel. And one of the things that came up was, and this was prior to the announcement earlier this week, was people feeling like something bad, really bad would have to happen before real change came. Are we still thinking that? Is that still a thing that people think, that something, we have to be in full-blown crisis, meltdown for real change to happen? Or do you think that we can rise to the occasion?
I guess in some ways, against all odds, I do have belief in people. Against all evidence to the contrary in so many ways in this basin. I feel like maybe if there's enough of us inviting people to their better selves, to evoking a sense of compassion that sits right next to technical and legal knowledge, that maybe we can strive to figure out a better solution and avoid the catastrophe. If you ask me in 3 or 4 minutes, I don't know if my answer will be the same, but that's where I am right now.
Yeah, I think that it depends, kind of what I said earlier about, how hard do we work to keep this window of opportunity open? How hard do we work to make this a truly equitable and inclusive process moving forward from this opportunity that we've been given? We have that choice, and we have a lot of power as people.
So what is catastrophe? I mean, is it Tuesday's announcement, right? Is it the graphs, or is it something else? I'm going to stay in character here on the tribal side. I mean, it's the basin for a lot of these tribal folks has been in crisis for 150 years, right? So it's there, and I think we answered that question yesterday. If a catastrophe or something is going to motivate everyone, I felt people were motivated. That's what I felt here. And people are interested and have taken this very seriously. So I think it's honest.
I agree with Daniel, like if between the tribal crisis of 150 years and the 21st century climate change crisis and the reservoir impacts in Jim Prairie's graph with the combined storage getting down to 1 million acre foot, like if that's not motivating crisis, then we're there. I think we're there. And so I think that the way to operationalize that is, and someone mentioned it here and it's been talked about a couple times throughout the day, is this idea of empathy. Like if we are empathetic towards those who are saying we're in crisis for 150 years, that helps, I think, take action on this crisis. Another thing that really stuck with me was when I was doing my research here with Doug, I talked to some of the folks from Mexico who are part of the binational negotiations leading up to Minute 319, and they said they don't go into negotiation unless they've done this concept of catharsis, as they called it, which basically, it was explained to me that you truly have to understand where the other person's coming from, what their values are, what their challenges are, what their priorities are. Until you do that catharsis, as they called it, you're never going to come to an agreement with someone. So I think we have to do that catharsis with everyone in this basin, really empathize with other people's positions, and then we can take that crisis that some folks have been saying has happened for 150 years, and we can actually operationalize our response to that.
I've got one more question, and maybe I'll pass it over back to Doug and John. So it's always a fun thought experiment to think like emperor for a day, or I have a magic wand and I can make anything happen. For you guys, where would you begin to start? Like, say you were vested with this ability to kind of move things in a particular direction. How would you start? Where would you start?
I guess I would start that my daughter grows up to be a Grand Canyon river guide. Wave that wand and that will happen. I think if I had a magic wand, it would be something like I was saying earlier, like reprioritizing our values. And I don't want to be the one, even though I have the wand, I don't want to do that. We as a basin need to reprioritize our values. And I think if we had that hard conversation, we'd come to things like essential human needs, including tribal needs is number one. And then maybe a healthy river is number two. And then we can work through that list of values. That's what I would do, is really make sure that our system of laws and governance and institutions reflects our values today. And again, not 1922 values, but 2022 values. I would facilitate that. I would have a workshop around figuring out how to reprioritize our values if I had that magic wand.
What a great way to use a magic wand.
Great workshop. To host another conference. I've been struck here just by us talking and just the different things we've had. I mean, we've had a lot of emphasis on people and relationships and human emotion, right? And just in discussing how we want to share futures. I don't know if anyone's familiar, or I know people are familiar, but how many folks thought about or looked at United Nations Declaration of the Rights on Indigenous Peoples? I mean, when I thought about the compact, right? We thought about the compact itself, and we also talked about reforming it or changing it or amending it, adding to it. And there's a lot of human rights in there, right? Access to water, basic human rights, right? What if those were things that were a part of our compact? What if we had free, prior, and informed consent as a part of our compact? These are the things that we would talk about in John's workshop. But if I had a magic wand to do something that I think would be very useful, I think it would be to somehow institutionalize something to support tribes from the federal government level. And I'm not complaining about the federal government here. I'm just saying that there's always more, right? We always ask for more from tribes. Or better representation from our trustee, right? The tribal water, like, what if we have this incredible tribal water office somewhere? What if it's in CEQ somewhere? You know, maybe it's in the White House. But that's here. That shows up at this conference. Shows up at every water conference in the West, and is there on behalf of the administration, right? I love that reclamation's here. I love, like, we have great folks here from them. But, you know, it's just a different perspective. The tribes want their Indian Affairs person here because it's a different form. It feels like, you know, we don't love the BIA, but we kind of feel like we need the BIA because that's like our best representation often of our trustee. So having that to support tribes, or for tribes to see that, you know, Native people, having those folks in the room, I think would be really, would be magic wandish for me.
I will sound a little bit like a broken record, but I would like everybody to have to take a history class. And not, you know, like whatever you did in high school, because I thought those were terrible too, or at least some of them. But as I said earlier, I think that there's real power in history for humanizing the institutions we have, building compassion and building empathy and understanding, for example, you know, someday I'll write this paper, but we talk about the Colorado River as the American Nile a lot, and nobody really talks about why we call it that. Desert river, right? Okay, check the box. We call it that in large part, and I think 1922 is an interesting time or the anniversary of the compact for 1922 is an interesting time to think about this. 1922 is also when King Tut's tomb was discovered. And in large part, the reason that we call the Colorado the American Nile, this dates back to the late 19th century, was that there was these successive waves of, this is a real word, Egyptomania, that swept the Western world from the late 19th century into the 20th century as, you know, discoveries are made in Egypt of tombs of pharaohs, et cetera. And there's a real desire, if you look back at the writings from the late 19th century and early 20th, by folks who are making decisions about the river, to emulate the imperial and colonial power of the Egyptian empire, and to use that to build an economic powerhouse in the basin. I think if we can all take a history class and understand those roots of the institutions that we have now, that could be really powerful.
All right. At this point, at the end of the table here, if I had a magic wand, I would wave it in support of everything the three panelists have said. But I think in order to get there, to get to your idea, Daniel, what you proposed, I feel like we may need to loosen our attachment to the way things are right now, to the institutions and the legal doctrines that have been built up over the past 150 years. Perhaps the magic wand first would loosen our attachment to that in order to allow space in our minds and our hearts and our logic for different perspectives that could come in and then influence us. And so perhaps I would pave that way by asking right now, or observing rather, that at this conference, we've been very literate in technical language, in models and in data. And that's really important because it helps us understand the problem and it helps us kind of, put some boundaries and constraints around the solution sets. We've been very literate on policy and legal language. But is our language large enough to encompass the full experience of what we're in right now? And in that sense, I might assert that it is not, that we would need a language that allows us to access the heart or the actual emotion of our experience right now, perhaps an art language, poetry, drawing from indigenous wisdom and experiences and perspectives, to loosen and expand the way we actually talk about this, because ultimately language builds our reality. And so if we invite more language in, then our reality expands.
Started optimistic, we briefly deviated into pessimism, and we're back to optimism. So I call that a successful panel. Give everybody a round of applause.
All right, that was a very good phase one of this.
Yeah, stay up here.
Stay there. Okay. Stay. All right. And John, enough about workshops. You're just killing me with this workshop. That's quite the moonshot idea there. Okay. Here's a thought, and you can object if you want to, because at this point, it's a democracy. Because you could just go home. Okay. Let's continue talking. Let's do questions from the audience, because you've heard enough from John and I, who could ask our own questions, but we'll take questions. He'll run up down that aisle with that microphone. I'll run up and down the aisle with that microphone. We'll take audience questions. The audience, the panelists, and Luke, consider yourself a panelist at this point. You're a young gun, damn it. You have opinions. Well, hold on, I'm not done with the rules. The other rule is, if it's a great question, then sure, everyone take a stab at it. If the question really speaks to you, take a stab at it. But if it doesn't really speak to you, you can pass. No, because that'll let us to get through more people and more questions. And if you think it's a bad plan, we'll do something else. But let's start that way. And it sounds like Sharon's going to start us out.
Yeah, I don't know that I have so much a question than a comment. And I'm usually a middle of the road person, rather practical, don't have radical ideas that I voice publicly anyway. But as I was listening to you, and as we've heard about traditional ways and so forth, I thought about the concept of river personhood. And we know that that's occurred somewhere else. I think somebody in Colorado filed something in the courts that got dismissed probably out of hand. I sometimes use the term the Colorado River is unhealthy, it's in poor health. And my husband says, why do you say that? And that's what I think is the case. And I think as I listen to you, we have to not let the river die, right? And so even if we didn't officially do it, which might be too radical, what if we started thinking about the objective being the river doesn't die and think of it as a person? So if you have comments or whatever, I just think that that's a different way of thinking. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. And I would have said that 2 years ago. I mean, I thought when I read about that lawsuit, I thought, what is that person thinking? That'll never happen here in the United States. So
I'll weigh in here just because I like the idea because people tend to feel more obligations to other people, right? And so you just creates a responsibility maybe where there was less. When I was, at the Yurok tribe, we did that to the river, the Klamath River. The tribe passed an ordinance giving the river personhood rights because, hey, it's the river, and that's what feeds and takes care of the tribe. And so what's more important than that? Nothing. And so you codify that, you make that part of your law, and as we talked about, our laws represent our values, then yeah, make it happen. And so it also creates these rights that are arguably enforceable in tribal court. And so you go mess with the river, you're messing with one of your ancestors, and you're creating legal problems too. In practical ways here, you got to go to the court. But I think it's a modern representation of kind of that relationship, and I think it's worth it.
Okay. Can I add a little to that? So part of my history class would be
Interrogating the human nature divide, because these are not two separate things. But traditional Western ways of thinking about nature, the wilderness, these are Western constructs, do make them two separate things. And this is not the case. All environments are hybrid environments. And I think that goes a long way towards getting us to see the river as a person.
I just wanted to thank all the panelists. Wow, what an incredible conversation. And I just wanted to remind everybody, not remind everybody, but to maybe to remind, but about 5 years ago, Dr. Matt McKinney and I did a document called Toward the Sense of the Basin. We interviewed over 150 people in the basin, a lot of you in this room as well. And almost unanimously, everybody said they wanted to see a healthy, sustainable, living river, like that's across the board. And so I just wanted to add that in there. And again, to add that when you get to Morales Dam, there is no more Colorado River. The river needs, if it needs to be a healthy, sustainable, and living river, then it needs to go flow where it has flowed traditionally, and that's not happening.
Thanks for this panel. It's a great way to close out the past couple days. So there's a quote, I'm in the technology industry, there's a quote about technology. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And so I'm trying to think about how we can integrate, incorporate, have a nature and human beings be at the forefront of this discussion while recognizing technological advance, engineering advance. And so any thoughts on how we can sort of eliminate biases in some of these human innovations, if that makes sense. So I'm thinking about social media, let's say, and so the culture of the software engineers that developed social media become ingrained in that technology, and so learning from those sorts of mistakes, making sure that other cultural perspectives, human perspectives, other perspectives regarding nature are incorporated in some of these engineering solutions that are coming down the pike. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we can't eliminate bias without understanding that we have bias, right? And everybody has bias. And I don't know that we ever can really eliminate bias, but I think that understanding why that bias exists, where and how it plays out, allows us, and I am the last person to talk to about technology, ask my husband, but understanding why and how that plays out can allow us to correct for that bias. So understanding the roots of it, and then recognizing that it's present in everything we do, and how do we correct for that?
Cool. standard disclaimer, this question does not represent the views of my employer or the wonderful foundation that funds me. So you know it's going to be a doozy. With everything that we've heard about the climate change models, the need to rethink how we manage this as a river system as a whole rather than divided basins, should we perhaps remove that arbitrary dividing line and get rid of the dams that have sort of driven these targeted elevations and a lot of the river management for so long?
I think certainly that should be an agenda item at my workshop. The first part of your question, I think, is really interesting. The idea of removing this arbitrary dividing line. Something that a lot of other international river basins have done is establishing a river basin organization that oversees the whole basin. Her responsibilities, whose governance is the whole basin. I think that's a really interesting approach, and I think it's something we should consider. Going back, Bill Hazenkamp again this morning said, I think it was him who said, if we were going to redo this, we wouldn't have two basins. We wouldn't. It's inefficient. Doesn't make any sense. So I think that's a really interesting conversation that we should be having about, again, not tearing the whole thing apart, but just building upon it and building on a new part of the compact that is a river basin organization could be interesting. In terms of tearing down the dams, I'm less certain that is ever politically feasible, and or does that we've built a Western society based on those dams, and they exist because of them, and they, for better or worse, are probably going to be part of the solution in some sense. I think we can find way more interesting ways to incorporate them in environmental health, and but I think they do provide water to our growing economies, and so I think we can re-operate how they work, but I'm not sure we would see in our lifetime that they would actually come down, I guess.
Just quickly, I don't know enough to answer that second part of the question. I don't. I've read articles that say no, of course we can't do it. Actually, right? It's a great idea, but we can't do it. But I don't know. We're taking down the dams on the Klamath. Those are different dams, right? They're nothing like what we have in the basin here. But right, you think about it, you plan for it, and you think about your options. And I think that's what that's the conversation there. What if you did, right? Glen Canyon. Just look at Glen Canyon. What would it take to replace what you lost there? I think that's the place to start. I think these articles probably did that, and I just don't remember what they say. But I mean, these things change, right? Depending on what resource we're looking at. So I think, I think anything and everything could be on the table when you're looking at constantly reevaluating.
I would just add briefly too, for the beginning part of the question. In having conversations here, some people say that they felt relieved when they heard the announcement from the federal government earlier this week. It wasn't fear, it was this relief that someone was kind of taking charge. And I feel like there's a yearning for a certain kind of leadership that the collaborative governance model has all of these benefits in some ways, but one of the cons is nobody's really in charge. There's not one person or one entity that's making the decisions. It's this huge group of people who are. And so when I hear people say oh, I was relieved, I think what's the subtext is I wish somebody was taking charge of this particular issue. And so I think there's some appetite, and maybe even from people who you wouldn't think would have the appetite for something like that.
You got a question over there, John? I have one over here.
I may be older than both Greg and John, and so I want to represent the old goat panel. And for one thing, I think both the history lesson and the workshop actually need to be banquets. Because as an earlier speaker said, you've got to have people eating together to actually make something happen. But what I wanted to report was that in answer to the first question to this panel, I come from Wyoming, so and I've written a lot about the history of Wyoming water law and the staid nature of how people think about water in Wyoming, but the actual underlying thing that they actually all know it's a public resource and that they have to make adjustments. But anyway, so coming from there, my reaction when I first heard this news was, oh God, this is great, because it's going to make something happen. And I was talking to Corey, I don't know if he's still here, who told me that a guy we both know who's about my age who has a big ranch on the Green River, who has been very skeptical about demand management. I've talked to him at length about it. He went to Corey on Tuesday and said, I want to do a contract with you guys. And Corey, of course, being Corey, said, yeah, I know, I've been telling you that for years. You want to do a contract with me. But that, I mean, just that I know who the guy is, he, you know, I just was like, yeah, okay, this is gonna, that kind of thing, even though Wyoming doesn't have a whole lot to contribute in terms of volume, one of the things that guys like that and that many of us in the state are thinking about is the question of how do you move some of that water out without losing the riparian and wetlands and all those values, which are really what we have to offer in contrast to almond trees and grapefruit and stuff at the other end of the river. And so those considerations need to be met, but those people are thinking about that, and I think the state will try to get some sort of mechanism into demand management to be able to do that. But anyway, I just wanted to say as a member of the Old Goat panel that I found this quite exciting.
Okay, just some quick thoughts. I think that it seems like a crisis mode in some senses, but also we haven't actually hit any kind of failures yet. So it's sort of the last flag in some senses. Like something has to be done now. No more options, no more kicking the can down the road. We're recognizing that big changes are going to come if we don't do something. But I think there's ways to think about the opportunities that can come from something like this. One maybe being we need to stop thinking in terms of temporary short-term fixes and recognize that this may be the new normal or new abnormal or whatever. And so not just short-term reductions and wait and put it in bank and get it later, but maybe this is the new normal. We have to live with some structural changes, which I think could be pretty welcome. Opportunities such as like reoperation of the dams themselves. We haven't been able to touch that before, but as Jack Schmidt often says, the Grand Canyon is a ditch between two big buckets because it's operated completely in an engineering sense and not operated for a political sense, not in an engineering sense, not in an environmental sense, completely to meet a compact numbers that we don't know how it would even play out. So there's some opportunities. Because the reservoirs are so low, we can reoperate things and think of things in a different way that we haven't done before. Other ones, another good shout out to Jack, is management of sediment. So sometimes, oftentimes our problem with the Grand Canyon is the lack of sediment transport through it. Maybe the reservoir is being so low right now might be an opportunity to re-drill some of the bypass tubes or something like that to transport that sediment downstream, something that we wouldn't even have a chance to think about, but we do now in this short window of time. So a lot of big questions can be addressed because we have this crazy situation we need to get ourselves out of. Hopefully we can get through it. But I think as opposed to just trying to hold our breath, think of what can be done during this time.
Okay. We have some people writing in questions on the Zoom. Yeah, Mike.
I do. So we got one coming in from the Zoomers. If push comes to shove, what would be the consequences of Interior making the 2 to 4 million acre feet decision?
Asking a veteran. No, federal officials apparently. Or state officials. Well, the consequence would be, of them doing it would be, probably the states might not be happy. I mean, I would invite anyone else to respond to this too, because I think this is a group question probably. And a lot of you might have better answers. But my sense is, I mean, if Interior comes out and says, all right, you guys didn't get it done, bang, 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 there's your cuts, thanks, right? I mean, there's gonna be a lot of heartburn, there's gonna be a lot of anger. Politics aren't gonna be good. So I think that's gonna be a lot of frustration there.
I mean, just add real quick too that, yeah, I mean, no shape or form, like, okay to answer this question. But one thing, going back to Luke's comment that like there was a sense of relief, I think that's what we needed is a strong leadership. Leadership to say the hard things, leadership to do the hard things. And I think the hard thing is reducing uses, 2 to 4 million acre feet. But if the federal government does it, I think that is a leadership role that we desperately need. And I think it might not be welcome. There's going to be all sorts of politics around it. But there's a Mark Resner quote, and I'm probably going to screw this up, but it's something to the effect of like consensus is the absence of leadership. And I think in some sense, like we need a leader to step in. In this case, it's probably going to be the federal government to do the shortages or demand the shortages get done and fix a lot of the problems that we've been talking about.
I'm paid not to look too far into the future and just to be in the short term in the news industry. And so I think what I would be looking for is like a farmer's revolt in the basin, I think. Like that's what I would be watching for, because I think you've seen that kind of play out in other parts of the world with water shortages. Is you've got these, huge groups of farmers marching at capitals, demanding things from the federal government. And I think you'd probably see something similar. So that's what I would watch for.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on that is kind of what I was thinking too. The government seems to be in a different place here than other of those Western watersheds too, like CVP, where the federal allocations make a big difference to how the water is allocated every year, right? Or in the Klamath, where those allocations are to feed federal reclamation irrigation projects. That's not really the case on the Colorado. It's different, right? And the interior overlay is, and what reclamation's role is very different. So I think that gets kicked down to the states, and I think that's right.
All right. I see a lot of tiredness in the room. So, yeah. Oh, did I miss something? Ann, did you want to sneak one more question in? Okay. Having no end, we were kind of shutting down, but for you,
Ann may have had the answer for us that we were missing.
She probably wants details about when John's banquet is going to be, but I'm assuming.
I don't have another question. I was going to respond to your last one about, is she really going to do it? Yes, she told us they're going to do something on August 16th. They don't want to. They want to have an agreement presented to them from the states, because Hannah just said to me, and John Ensminger has said it before, their tools are blunt instruments. They have a hatchet. The states have scalpels. They can craft an agreement much better than the federal government can. But we heard it. They're not kidding. They're going to protect the reservoirs.
See, the threat of stopping gets the hands up. Go ahead, you can take a few. I should have started with the threat.
Sorry, Doug.
If I learned nothing today.
So this is sort of a question or a comment on what's missing, what aren't we talking about right now in this conference? And I think one of them is, we're talking about values that are kind of like bags, like, buckets, like ag or tribes or cities or so on. But there's also sort of the public in general that live in the cities or that eat food, or, I feel like one of the things that we can observe through I love this phrase about incrementalism leading to revolution. I think it was you saying that. I hope that one of the things that comes out of this crisis is awareness in the Western public in general, in cities and so forth, that water is very valuable. It doesn't seem to have reached everybody just yet. And yet there are some people starting to panic, and yet there are people who are just like, whatever, I'll run my lawn, I'll do my thing. That hasn't really trickled down yet, I guess, to the average person. And I wanted to actually just add a very specific thing to Julia Gulicci's myths about urban xeriscaping myths. You know, the cost of water, like people don't understand that water is really cheap right now, and running a utility costs a lot. Whether you charge for the water or you charge in a different way, you have to. It costs to run a utility. And another myth I've seen often is people saying, oh, it's just going to save you money if you put in xeriscape. That's not what actually happens. The utility has to raise rates to cover the cost of operating the system. The water's like almost like it's way underpriced, basically. And so I guess that's what I wanted to kind of say is tell me if you think it's wrong. I mean, this is just sort of Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, the Bureau, you know, running the river and kind of making everything work out just fine? Or is this something where people in general are going to have to figure out, like, water's very, very precious, and how do we make sure we're communicating that and kind of keeping that on the front burner and actually changing the values of everybody, not just the parties to the compact or the people who sit at the table?
Okay, I think I got the official kill sign there. So we're gonna wrap this up. Let's start by thanking our panel and Luke and our panel. Fantastic. And you know, I don't really have any prepared closing remarks or anything, but let me say that this was kind of a weird committee, and I can say a weird committee because we were never designated as a committee or met together, but several of us contributed to this design of this. Alice and John and Jaime and Chelsea, and who am I forgetting? I was involved. Sean, well, yeah, Sean. Sean's like the guy over top with the string. Yeah. Thank you. So well done, all of you. As usual, thanks to if you've been here before, you've heard me say this. I've always thought these were the best Colorado River conferences because we always had good speakers, but we always had the best audience. People with deep thoughts and good attitudes. And so thank you all for coming to Boulder. I know Boulder's a horrible place to come to this time of year, but thank you for doing that. I really don't know what else to say except.
We're good, except for one round of applause for you.
Oh, yeah, thank you. All right.